With biomolecules, and we are now moving on to our next unit, which is photosynthesis and cellular respiration. You get this section using the table of contents on the first page. Just click on photosynthesis and cellular respiration. It'll bring you to your vocabulary list, and that is what we are doing today. So this is your unit vocabulary for this unit, which is photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Watch the video, pause it, make sure you understand it. Complete your vocabulary slides. I prefer it if you do the definition, a sentence, and the picture first, and then you come back and do all of the graphic organizers when you're done with that. Just a real quick overview. Photosynthesis is how plants make sugar or glucose, and then cellular respiration is how living things use that glucose to make energy or ATP. Right, so our first word is autotroph, and you'll use this word when we get into ecology also. But an autotroph is anything that makes their own food. So auto would be like self, and troph would be like feeding or eating. So autotrophs make their own food. Probably the biggest example is going to be plants. So when we talk about producers, we're talking about autotrophs. They're kind of that same word. So a good graphic organizer for an autotroph would be to compare this word autotroph with the next word, which is heterotroph. Or if you're a little bit more advanced, you could make sure that you know the equation for photosynthesis, which is this chemical equation written right here, which is 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 waters plus sunlight makes glucose, which is C6H12O6, and then 6 oxygen molecules. All right, so our next word is heterotroph. So autotrophs make their own food, while heterotrophs have to eat to get their own food. So these are consumers. So autotrophs are producers, heterotrophs are consumers. You already should know this. Hetero means other, and then troph is feeding. So examples are animals. I threw this word in here, detrivore, because a lot of you guys might not know it, but detrivores kind of eat dead things or decompose things. So I like this picture here. So our plants are our autotrophs, then all of our consumers, our primary, our secondary, our tertiary consumers, they are all heterotrophs. Same graphic organizer idea. You could compare autotroph to heterotroph. Or if you're a little bit more advanced, you can learn the equation for cellular respiration, which is when we take glucose and we make that energy, ATP. So this is glucose plus oxygen makes carbon dioxide, water, and ATP energy. So once again, the difference between autotroph and heterotroph. Autotroph are plants usually. They make their own food. They do photosynthesis. They're producers. And then heterotrophs are something that eats that plant to get energy. So these are our consumers. You guys are obviously heterotrophs. All right, our next word is actually the chemical equation for photosynthesis. So 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water plus sunlight makes glucose plus 6 oxygen molecules. And it's pretty important that you guys know this equation. Because if you can learn this equation, cellular respiration will be pretty easy for you. So this right here, this equation is photosynthesis, and all that is when we turn carbon dioxide and sunlight into glucose. And remember that glucose is sugar, and we use that sugar to make ATP. I love this picture here. This is a plant, obviously. So the things that go in, water goes into the roots, carbon dioxide goes into the leaves, and then sunlight is captured, and what comes out is oxygen and sugar. So here's a couple other words that might help out for you guys. They're not on your vocab list. If you want to make slides for them, I'll give you extra credit. But a reactant is anything that goes into a chemical equation. So here's our chemical equation, and what goes in is carbon dioxide and water. And make sure you know this, carbon dioxide goes in through the leaves, and then water goes in through the roots, and then a product is anything that comes out. And you guys saw these words when you talked about enzymes, right? The reactants go in and the products come out. So the products here would be glucose and oxygen. All right, our good graphic organizer here would be to compare photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So photosynthesis is a process of making that sugar, right? So here we made the sugar, and then if I turn this arrow around, I go the other direction. So I have oxygen plus sugar, I make energy, water, and carbon dioxide, and that would be cellular respiration. Um, so learn this equation. You guys need to know it, or if you know it, then cellular respiration will be a lot easier. So here is cellular respiration. This is the equation for cellular respiration. And it is basically the same as photosynthesis, except I switched my reactants to my products. So what goes into cellular respiration is going to be the glucose and the oxygen that was made by photosynthesis. So we eat glucose, we breathe oxygen. And the whole purpose that we do that is to make energy, make ATP. And then something else comes out, which is carbon dioxide and water. And then this carbon dioxide and water will go back into that autotroph or back into the plant, and then it will use it to make glucose and oxygen. So it's this big circle. So our reactants here are glucose and oxygen. Once again, we eat the glucose and we breathe the oxygen, and then the products are going to be ATP. That's our main product. So good graphic organizer, once again, compare photosynthesis to cellular respiration, or if you're more advanced, do something with that equation for cellular respiration. So here's that ATP energy that was released. Glucose goes in, oxygen goes in, energy comes out, and then I also have some carbon dioxide and water. And then that carbon dioxide and water will go into the plant, and what will be produced would be the glucose and the oxygen. Right. So product, I already mentioned it, is something that is produced by a reaction. Reactants go in, products come out. Make sure you know that the product of photosynthesis is the reactant of cellular respiration, and then the reactant of photosynthesis is the product of cellular respiration. So it's a big circle. So a good graphic organizer, compare product to reactant, or compare the products of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. I prefer that you do this one. It's going to be more advanced. It will help you learn it. Here's a little sentence for you. mRNA is the product of transcription. All right, and reactants go in. That should say in, not it. And products come out. So glucose, oxygen are the reactants of cellular respiration. Good graphic organizer, what I would do is this one, compare the products of photosynthesis and cellular respiration, or if you already did that, compare the products of, compare product to reactant. So this one right here, it starts with sugar, so I know this is going to be cellular respiration because we eat sugar, we breathe oxygen, and then we produce ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. All right, our next term is chloroplast, and we've already covered this when we talked about cells and organelles, but chloroplast is the organelle found in plants that does photosynthesis. So here's a picture of a chloroplast. This word chloro actually means green. You HST people should know that. But what happens is there's things in here that will capture sunlight. Some carbon dioxide will go in there and some water will go in there, and there'll be a series of chemical reactions, and it will produce glucose and oxygen that will come out. All right, so a basic graphic organizer would be to compare a chloroplast with mitochondria. Once again, chloroplasts make the sugar. The mitochondria will use that sugar to make energy. Or if you're more advanced, learn the different parts of a chloroplast, like the stroma, thylakoid, granum, inner membrane, and outer membrane. I really like this picture here. You could tell these are plant cells because they're kind of squared here. And all these little green things in here are going to be chloroplasts. So this is obviously a plant that does a lot of photosynthesis. And our next word is mitochondria. So mitochondria is the organelle that conducts cellular respiration. Or an easier way to say it, mitochondria take glucose and make ATP. They look like this. They kind of look like a little bean. They're usually brown colored or reddish color. That's why your muscles are that color. Um, Good graphic organizer, basic one, once again, compare chloroplast and mitochondria. Or a more advanced one would be to learn the different parts of the mitochondria, like the outer membrane, intermembrane space, which is between the inner and outer membrane, the cristae, and the matrix. This next word, stomata, you guys will actually see this word again when we talk about plants, but a stomata is a hole in a leaf. So you can see there's a little zoomed in picture of this part of this leaf, and there's little holes in here, and they are called stomata. And what they do is they allow carbon dioxide to go in, and then they allow water and oxygen to come out. So these holes have to be open for photosynthesis to happen, because that's how carbon dioxide gets into the cells. So basically just conducts gas exchange. UHST people, you might see this word stoma. So anytime you have like a hole in the body, it's called a stoma. And we do some artificial holes, like if somebody has something wrong with their intestines, we could cut off the bad part and then connect the intestines to a hole in their abdominal wall. And instead of the poop coming out their butt, that poop will drain out into a bag. It's called a colostomy bag. All right, so a good graphic organizer for stomata is to draw how that stomata works with photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And that means that the carbon dioxide goes in for photosynthesis, and the oxygen will come out with photosynthesis. So you see here, this is a picture of that stomata. This is when it's open. It's actually two little cells. And there's big vacuoles in it, and these vacuoles actually control if they're open or closed. So when they're open, carbon dioxide could go in or oxygen could come out. And then when they're closed, nothing could come in or out. A lot of plants that live in the desert, they're closed during the day because the desert's so hot, and if it's really hot and this hole's open, it's gonna all the water in it is gonna evaporate. So a lot of desert plants or southern plants will close those stomata during the day and only open them at night. All right, so here's another picture zoomed in from the leaf. Here I have an open stomata. Here I have a closed stomata. And our next one is glucose. This is really, really important. That's why you've seen it like 10 times. But this is our main monosaccharide. And hopefully remember, mono means one or a single unit. And then saccharide is kind of that science word for sugar. So glucose is the most important single sugar. You need to know the equation for it. So this is all the elements that are involved. C6H12O6. And this should make sense, right? When we do our biomolecules, carb, lipid, acid, protein, well, our carbs are sugars, and the only elements that sugars have or carbs have is CHO, right? CHO, CHOMP, CHON. So C, H, and O. And then for this glucose, we arrange it. So there's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. It is what is made by photosynthesis, and it is what we eat so that we can make energy. Anytime you guys see this shape, I just want you to assume that it is a glucose. And every little corner here is going to be a carbon. So if I counted it, except for this one, if I counted it, I have 6 carbons. I have 12 H's or 12 hydrogens, and I have 6 oxygens. So C6H12O6. So a good graphic organizer here would be to draw the different ways you see glucose. You might see it written out like this, C6H12O6. When you see that, you should know, oh, that's glucose. When you see that shape right here, that 6-sided shape, you should go, oh, that's glucose. And then rarely you guys might see this right here, which would be another glucose. And something you'll learn in chemistry, anytime you have an angle here, that is going to be a carbon. So actually have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygen here. They're just not all spelled out. And you might also see it like this in a straight line. So you can see the carbons here. Well, that's the angles in here. All right, the next word is chlorophyll. Remember, chloro means green, and then fill. This is the green stuff that fills up your chloroplast. So chlorophyll is what actually captures the sunlight, or that energy from the sunlight, and it gives plants that green color. And it does that by absorbing all of the colors except for green. So we've actually shown that blue light and red light's really good light to grow plants with, because it absorbs those, and it kind of makes these other ones reflect. In fact, if we gave a plant green light, it's not going to grow very well because it's going to reflect all that light and it can't get any energy to do photosynthesis. So a good graphic organizer here for chlorophyll would be just to draw how photosynthesis works, but include a chlorophyll in it. And here's another picture of photosynthesis where water goes into the root, carbon dioxide goes into that stomata in the leaf. The chlorophyll captures that sunlight, and it's going to turn that into food, which is glucose or sugar, and then oxygen will be released out of that stomata. All right, and that brings us to the two hard things, or a couple of hard things on here. So the next two slides, or the next two terms, are the two steps or two parts of photosynthesis. And they are very, very complicated. You don't have to understand all these minute details in it quite yet until you get to like AP biology, but make sure you kind of understand the gist of it and you understand these words. So the first one is light-dependent reaction. This is how photosynthesis starts. So what happens first is the chlorophyll inside these chloroplasts will capture sunlight. So it's these little things right here. They're going to capture sunlight. And there's a part in here called a thylakoid, which is going to use that energy from the sunlight to make some molecules called NADPH and also a little bit of ATP. So that's what you kind of got to understand here. You don't really have to understand exactly what's going on in these pictures, but these two things are using the sun, the energy from the sun, to create something called NADPH, which is right here. So what it actually does is it turns this thing called NADP into NADPH. And then I also created a little bit of ATP, and I'm going to use these two things. I'm going to use NADPH and ATP in the second part. This is a little bit more simplified picture of it. So there's that photosystem 1, here's that photosystem 2. Well, this is where we're going to capture sunlight, and we're actually going to use the energy from the sun to produce this thing right here, NADPH. And then this right here is an enzyme that's going to produce a little bit of ATP. This is actually where oxygen is released. So what I actually do is I split this H2O, this water molecule. Oxygen's released back out through that stomata. Then I'm going to use the H's to create a little bit of energy. So a good graphic organizer idea here would be to compare the two parts of photosynthesis. The two parts are the light-dependent reaction, which I just quickly went through, and then the next one, which is the Calvin cycle. So this is photosynthesis right here. These are those two parts. So that light-dependent reaction is going to capture sunlight, and it's going to create these two things. It's going to create ATP and NADPH. And then I'm going to use this ATP and NADPH in the next one to turn carbon dioxide into glucose. Right, so our next one is called the Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reaction, but most people call it the Calvin cycle. This is the second part of photosynthesis, and what it does is it takes this NADPH and that little bit of ATP, and it turns carbon dioxide into glucose, basically. So carbon dioxide goes in, I use that ATP, that NADPH, and what will come out will be glucose. This is a little bit more complicated of the thing, but it's still the same thing. Carbon dioxide's going in. I'm going to take ATP, I'm going to take NADPH, and I'm going to create that sugar, which is glucose. Don't worry about all the other details of this other stuff. All right, so good graphic organizer for the Calvin cycle is to compare those two parts, the light-dependent reaction and the Calvin cycle. Here's both of them together. So this right here is my chloroplast. That chlorophyll is going to capture the sunlight. Water is going to go in, and I'm going to use that energy from the sun to split that water apart. Oxygen will come out. I'm going to use these hydrogens to create NADPH. And if you see what happened here, this thing NADP goes in. I add the H from it from the water, and now I have NADPH. And I'm going to use that NADPH and the ATP to turn carbon dioxide into glucose or sugar. All right, so that was the two parts of photosynthesis, the light-dependent reaction and the Calvin cycle. Now there are three parts to cellular respiration, and these are even more complicated. But you do need to know at least this first one, glycolysis. And remember, this word lyse or lysis means to break or to split. And we're going to say glyco is related to glucose. So we're going to split glucose apart. And that's what happens in glycolysis. So the first part of cellular respiration, and remember this happens in the mitochondria, is we eat that glucose. The glucose goes to just outside of that mitochondria, and it will be split down into something called pyruvate, and then later turned into something else called acetyl coenzyme. And this glucose, what's produced, that pyruvate, that is going to go into the mitochondria, and it's going to produce some other stuff later on. But here's that process of glycolysis. I split down that glucose into two pyruvates. And a little bit of ATP is produced, but just two. So for every glucose molecule, I'm going to make 2 ATP in glycolysis, which remember is the first part of cellular respiration. So good graphic organizer here would be to compare the 3 steps to cellular respiration, which is glycolysis, the next step, Krebs cycle, and the last step, electron transport chain. I would definitely do this as your graphic organizer and pay attention to how many ATP are produced in each one of these steps. So here is that glycolysis where I turn glucose into that pyruvate. So I'm going to also produce 2 ATP or 2 net ATP molecules here. Then it's going to enter that mitochondria. So here's my mitochondria, and it's going to go into this next part, which is the Krebs cycle. All right, so the Krebs cycle is the second part of cellular respiration. And this is where we're going to create this kind of electron imbalance between two sides of a membrane. This is also where we release that carbon dioxide. So I already said that pyruvate kind of later turns into this, acetyl coenzyme A. So I took that glucose, I broke it down into 2 pyruvates, which turned into this acetyl coenzyme A. And that is what goes through that Krebs cycle. And what I'm going to do here is create this little electron imbalance. Now I could also do it with fat. I could turn fat through this and amino acids through it. But the main thing is going to be taking glucose and turning it into energy. So a good graphic organizer here, once again, I would keep with the same one, compare the different parts of cellular respiration. So this is where we are right now, that Krebs cycle, so that those pyruvates came in. And what I did is I created a little bit of ATP and then this electron imbalance with NADH and something called FADH2 or FAD. So NAD and FAD. And this NAD and FAD is going to go into the last part, which is the electron transport chain. And this is the real meat and potatoes of cellular respiration. This is where the majority of our ATP is made. So the electron transport chain, it's the last step of cellular respiration. And what we do is we use this electron imbalance to create ATP. and we're going to tie in a bunch of previous things that we've talked about. So what we do is we use diffusion. So our electrons are going to diffuse through an enzyme, which we talked about last class, to create this ATP. So here you can see this membrane. So these are phospholipids, phospholipid bilayer. On one side, I have a whole bunch of hydrogens, and on the other side, I don't have that many. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 maybe, and then I have a whole bunch on this side. So remember, with diffusion, I want to go from where there's more to where there's less. So it's naturally going to do that. Unfortunately, it can't get through this cell membrane. So instead of going through this membrane, it's going to go through this helper protein, and that would be like facilitated diffusion. Well, this helper protein is actually an enzyme. It's called ATP synthase. So remember, enzymes are usually named after what they do. Well, synthesis is to build. So we're going to build ATP. And then enzymes usually end in ACE, ASE. So I know this is an enzyme right here. So these electrons are going to diffuse through here. And every time an electron comes through here, it kind of like spins this little top right here, and it turns ADP, adenosine diphosphate, into adenosine triphosphate. So I have a whole bunch of hydrogens that are going to come through here, and every time it comes down, it's going to start creating a bunch of ATP molecules. So that brings us to our graphic organizer, and you can see here it creates a whole bunch of ATP. So that first step, glycolysis made 2, Krebs cycle made 2, but the electron transport chain makes a whole bunch of ATP. So I could take one glucose molecule and I can make, anywhere between 20 to 30 ATP maybe. So the better you are at metabolism, probably the more ATP you're going to make. Or maybe the slower your metabolism, maybe it'll be on the lower side, around 20, 25. But that's our electron transport chain. Now I know that was a lot of detail for the steps to photosynthesis, which is the light-dependent reaction in the Calvin cycle, and then the steps to cellular respiration, which is glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. And it's okay if you don't memorize those minute details. Just make sure you understand, one, the terms, what they're associated with. So, Krebs cycle would be photosynthesis or cellular respiration. Glycolysis would be cellular respiration. Make sure you know that. And then make sure you know what's produced, So with the Calvin cycle, I'm going to produce that glucose. And then, electron transport chain, I'm going to produce a whole bunch of ATP molecules. Now, there are two types of respiration that you need to be aware of. One is called aerobic respiration, and the second one is called anaerobic respiration. So what aerobic respiration is, it is when I use oxygen to make ATP. So those three steps that I just talked about, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, well, it needs oxygen. Okay, so that electron transport chain needs oxygen to make all of that ATP. Most of our ATP is made through aerobic respiration. This is why we breathe. This is normal cellular respiration. So a graphic organizer here would be to compare aerobic and anaerobic. So what anaerobic respiration is, this is when I make ATP without oxygen. Now normally you guys would do this like if you're sprinting, your heart rate's real high, your muscles need a lot of energy. That's why you're breathing really fast to get all that oxygen, but maybe you're not getting enough oxygen. So your muscles will do this anaerobic respiration to help create some emergency ATP. Or maybe like when you're doing exercise, like lifting weights, and you feel that burning in your muscles from that lifting weight. Or most of you guys, when you're coming up the stairs, your legs will start burning. Well, what happened is your cells ran out of oxygen, and they stopped doing aerobic respiration, and they're now doing anaerobic respiration. And remember from your vocab, a or and means without. Arrow, that's going to be oxygen or air, so this is going to be without oxygen. Oops, sorry about that. So it doesn't make a lot of ATP. I'm going to do the first step, glycolysis. I'll probably do the second step, the Krebs cycle, but I can never do the electron transport chain because I don't have oxygen. So I can make, maybe 4 ATP instead of, 30 ATP. And something else that is made when I do this is called lactic acid. So that burning in your muscles when you're coming up the stairs, the reason it's burning is because there's an acid building up inside those muscles, and it's called lactic acid. And that is a byproduct of anaerobic respiration. But we also use this for our diet and stuff like that. We use it to make alcohol, like beer and wine and stuff like that, is made of this process called anaerobic respiration. So a good graphic organizer, compare aerobic and anaerobic. Here's a good comparison. So aerobic happens in the mitochondria. This is where I use oxygen to turn glucose into a whole bunch of ATP. Whereas anaerobic respiration, I'm still going to turn glucose into ATP, just not as much, maybe 4 ATP at the most. And I'm either going to produce this lactic acid or this alcohol, depending on what kind of organism it is. And you might see this word fermentation. Well, that is going to be related to anaerobic respiration. And then back to this little comparison chart from earlier. Aerobic, I use glucose and oxygen. I make a whole bunch of ATP, and it happens in that mitochondria. It has glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. Whereas anaerobic respiration, I'm going to take glucose, make a couple of ATP, and then produce some lactic acid or some alcohol, and it never actually goes into the mitochondria. And so fermentation, it does glycolysis, but it doesn't do that electron transport chain. All right, so that is all of your terms. That's all 18 terms for photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Once you're done, make sure you go back and you do all of your graphic organizers, and then I will grade this probably in a week or so. If you guys have any questions on it, feel free to reach out. But remember, grades are coming up pretty quick, so make sure you get your work in.